Folks, just please stand up and stretch. Like wave your laptops in the air, like you don't care. I know we are contravening the Geneva Convention on medium-sized meetings by having you sit here for this long. So now you can just stretch a little bit, sit back down. If you have to pee, I won't be offended. And actually, there we go. Which way is forward? It's gonna take me, oh, come on, guys. Really? Let's see. Will I figure it out? Others smarter than me have failed. No. I know, is it the green button or the forward button? Guys, good. I'm not gonna get any badge for this. Okay, what button am I pressing? The one on the right. Okay, I'm pressing the one on the right. Oh, yay. Hi. I'm Mark Surman from Mozilla. And I, while not being a programmer, or at least not probably for 30 years since I was in high school, identify as a nerd. And so I need to start a little bit with how many people self-identify as nerds in the room? All right. So this talk is for everybody, but this talk is about the nerds. And in particular, as Connie and David talked about, I think as you all know in your hearts or why you're here, we really have an incredibly ambitious revolutionary agenda that we're talking about here. We're talking about really transforming learning in a way that many of us have talked about for decades, but that hasn't been easy to have happen on a society-wide scale in the 100 years since we set the tone for how schools work today. So that's a big deal. And I want to talk about the role the nerds play in that and how critical they are in actually making those kinds of transformations possible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about badges. I'm going to talk about the plumbing underneath badges and the plumbing underneath social transformations that we've actually seen the internet allow to happen. But I am going to talk a little bit about learning first. And I guess my motivation and Mozilla's motivation for being in this space, which is not just about badges. In fact, I think, like most of you, we have particular things we want to see happen in learning that badges are a vehicle for. So let me start with that. So we're going to talk about learning. So this is my high school yearbook photo. And the amazing story with this is they wouldn't publish it because of the cigarette. It is not a joint. It is a hand-rolled cigarette. And they censored it, and I had to photocopy it and hand it out to everybody to paste in. So I think, I was a really motivated learner, even though the school system didn't love me. I was very DIY. In fact, I think you find a lot of people who are in the web industry and have been pioneers, came from punk rock. So very into DIY, making photocopy magazines, sitting on the floor of the public library in my 10,000 person Northern Ontario mill town reading the history of all anarchist philosophers. And, so I didn't lack for desiring to learn. But, school, oops, I did not look like that at all. This is crazy, this clicker. I'm going to Staples. So school looked like this still. And, we had to memorize Shakespeare. I didn't like it. And so, I had from quite early on a sense that I love to learn. Learning was a way to get things done, to explore things that excited me. All the stuff that, viscerally probably most of us felt that Connie's talked about in connected learning. But the place where we're supposed to learn felt like this, didn't feel flexible. And of course, many of us for very long amounts of time have been trying to change how the school works as an environment for learning. And it's not like we've made no progress. I mean, it is very different than purely the kind of moving people from agriculture to the Industrial Revolution and the cities, which is how we started out. We have changed. And in fact, we continue to be in a particularly, well, it won't go, interesting moment where, with MOOCs and things like that, we're looking at digital actually having some meaningful large-scale changes, at least that we're talking about. But still it is within this idea of the classroom, the time schedule of the industrial era, and really that it's the place where we say learning is happening is the only place that learning happens. And of course, we know that's not the case, has never been the case. And in Mozilla's situation, we set out about 3 years ago to learn how to use a clicker. It's amazing. This is not going to be the TED Talk that they record that gets used over and over again. We set out with a very big agenda, possibly as big as badges, so we're doing 2 for 1, which is to teach the world how the web works, to really embrace the idea that digital literacy and web literacy are as important as reading, writing, and math. And we realized as we started on that agenda, which is core to our mission of keeping the internet open, that that's not going to happen in a classroom, or at least not going to happen only or primarily first in a classroom. So we do a lot of just getting volunteers around the world to just rock up a laptop and teach people how the web works. And that's a grassroots volunteer movement that we're building. And it happens in mobile environments, and it happens across cities. It happens all over the place. And these are all examples, as you may tell from the logo, of Hive networks of educators who are doing this kind of digital literacy work and creativity and making work with us. So, the story of this, when I go back to being that high school punk kid, it's exciting that as we've met people like Connie, people like you in the room, we've seen there is a different way to do learning. It's not necessarily that new, but it is revolutionary because it's not how most of us think about learning. It's not how our societal resources for learning get spent. And so it's actually good news. It's actually hopeful, especially if you hang out in this posse and then you see, as you throw out those ideas around the world, how people pick them up and run with them, which is what's happened with the hives. But the problem is, this is still, for most part, the only way to recognize or that people accept as recognizing learning. It's the way to recognize learning that only these people can give out. And so there's a big disconnect between the innovation that is happening in learning and our ability to recognize that learning, have it mean something in society, have us guide us. And so that obviously is where badges come in, where we got very selfishly involved in badges from the beginning, which is we want to recognize that learning digital skills is important, but so many of us are innovating how learning happens and need a way to recognize things that is that's going to work and that is not the diploma and is not the degree. And so, that's our motivation for being inside of it. The interesting thing in terms of acting on that motivation is about, 2010 we were talking about before. So about 4 years ago, just over the highway behind Stanford at Carnegie Foundation, a bunch of us got together. We were at the beginning of that web literacy project and said, well, could we use badges for this? And from the beginning we thought it's only going to work, as both David and Connie talked about, if we have a technology that means that whoever gets into this connects to everybody who gets into this. That if we want learning anywhere, anytime to work in terms of being supported with credentials like badges, we need a standard. And so I'll talk about it a little bit in a moment, but a badge is just a symbol with a set of data behind it, basically. It's not that complicated a thing. And so how do you take the idea of a technical standard and say we really want to transform a massive part of how our society practices something, learning, and how we spend resources? And is that even possible? And so I thought, this is the nerd part of the talk, so warning a little bit. I thought it might be good to say, have we done that before? What are some other examples? And why does something like the badges standard matter in that kind of social transformation? And so I thought it'd be useful to just look at email and how email evolved over the last couple of decades. So just a little survey. How many people here have an email account? Awesome. I'm in a room of friendly people. How many people, just go inside yourself for a moment. How many people remember or had an email account in, say, 1985? That's a pretty big amount for this room. So in 1985, well, 83, how many people, 83 if you want to get really specific. Oh, it goes way down. And so the thing is, email is a concept or electronic messaging between computers and networks been floating around since the 70s. But by the time you get to 1983, there's really only 100,000 people on the planet who've got email after, conceptually even longer than a decade of talking about it, but since very first rudimentary systems were seen. And you really only have, NSFNet actually didn't technically exist till 2 years later, but you only really had the precursor of the internet, the academic networks, as a mainstream, large-scale email system. So in the scale of the planet, in the scale of email today, it was very tiny. And what happens is by the, not that long later, commercial services start to come into the picture. And you start to see significant growth over a pretty short period of time, from 100,000 to 250,000 people, as these little, essentially commercial bulletin board systems offer email to people for personal use, not just for academic use. And so that interest in giving a new innovation to people by the private sector becomes important. And by '89, you've now, that's 4 years, quadrupled that number. And one of the reasons is that these networks start to connect to each other. So in that previous slide over here, it's really, you can only email people on CompuServe if you're on CompuServe. You can only email people on AOL if you're on AOL. And what happens here is you get a lot more people because the networks connect. You start to have network effects. But one of the things that's interesting is, and I actually did check my history, it's only CompuServe that really uses a proper internet connection, and actually MCI mail, to the rest of the academic internet that starts a two-way exchange using the open standards behind what we now have as internet email. But all these other guys have these proprietary gateways that are different colors. And so if I want to send mail from APC, which is actually a nonprofit activist computer network started in '89 that I helped run, to AOL, you'd actually have to negotiate and figure out how to go through this proprietary gateway. And it's possible, and we got to 1 million people that way, but it was a bunch of work and everything was kind of different. And so what happens, around the same time as the web becomes popular, more people get internet connections, all those things are also a part of the picture, is everybody just moves over to using the same way of sending email as that little academic network, the NSFNet, which CompuServe had started to talk to. So SMTP, doesn't matter what it's called, simple mail transfer protocol, and other standards get taken on as the main way that we send email. And you don't, at that point, ever think, I can't send email between my company and my commercial server and my academic network. And look at that. We've gone in 7 years from 1 million to 25 million people. So this starts to become a relevant part of society. You probably can remember the mid-'90s, if you're as old as me, quite vividly, where people are debating over whether email is a legit form of business communication or how it's changing your organization and all these kind of things. And before there was too much spam. And so, not that surprising, because we just all raised our hands, we've gone to something that was 100,000 people in 1983 to now, or depending how you count it, I took the lowest number I could, there's 2.8 billion people with email on the planet. And so, what seemed daunting or seemed like just, a sideshow in the 80s and even the early 90s becomes basically a ubiquitous form of communication for big parts of humanity. And a critical piece in it, an absolutely critical piece from coming over the hump from the fringes to the mainstream, and actually, to transforming a lot of how our society works, is that open standard. And we don't think about that every day. When we think about email every day, we think about how it will instruct us to click the button. We think about it looking like this. And this is me sending myself an email about badges. But this is what we think of as an email. But really, what changed the world about email, what changed the world about email is our use of it and our social practices, but is that all emails really look like this underneath. So computers know what an email looks like. All or most computers now look for the same things in terms of what an email looks like. They know who to send them to. They know whether there's a file attached to them. They know all of those kind of things. And so it is actually this that we can thank for the fact that we all put up our hands. And it's very nerdy, and we don't think about it, but it's actually really, really important. So, badges. Badges at this point, well, actually, I'll go to it later. But badges, in order to succeed, have to overcome some of the same challenges, or standards have to be there to look at that same kind of adoption. And so there's a lot of opportunity for that. It's opportunity we're here in the room to talk about. We've got a world where we're starting to think about the learner at the center of how learning happens, not just institutions, and where new things are happening, whether they're MOOCs like edX, or whether they're connected learning projects like UMedia, or whether they're the private sector like Pearson or Mozilla's digital literacy things. There are more and more ways that we offer learning opportunities that are explicitly about learning beyond just the classroom. And so learners are getting excited and taking advantage of those things. But if we actually want to credential those things, recognize those things, look at pathways between those things, the learner needs to take that into their own identity in the way that Connie talked about. And so you need a mechanism for that, which we have now with badges, but we're still developing. And you also need a mechanism to take what you have learned and show it to the world as a part of your regular online identity. So most of how people, or much of how young people, but all of us project ourselves out in the world beyond our immediate social circles and even within them is through social networks and other digital manifestations of our identities. And so what we came up with, actually with a bunch of Mozilla Identity people participating at that thing at Carnegie in 2010, is the idea that we need something, we need a standard that actually will connect all of those transactions. So if we want to have a way of credentialing that connects both the ways we are learning diversely across society and the digital identities we have, then back to careers and higher ed and all of those things, we need a lingua franca for all of those credentials. And that's what the OBI is, the Open Badges Infrastructure, is a standard just like email standards that let credentials move around, connect in a manner that gets us past the silos. And so if you look at badges, like many of the ones David shows, like an email, they kind of look like this. It says, what have I learned and what's it for and what did I do? And that's the human readable form. But at the core of it, right from the very beginning, this is actually what matters about a badge. It looks very much like that email header. You can read in the things it says, lots of the same stuff you said on that screen, but it's so machines know things like, what is the badge about? What might it connect to? Who was it signed by? Do we know that that person is real? All these things actually are the things that will allow us to scale and grow the idea we're talking about. And if we don't do that, and it's really easy, and we were talking about this over dinner, if we don't push on that standard and make it provide utility for us in terms of that interchange, it'll become irrelevant. It's much easier for all of us in the room to implement badge systems and not give a shit about the standard. And it's also easy to implement badge systems in ways that we don't push on the standard. Yes, we comply with it because it's good, it's granola, we're eating our granola, but we don't actually figure out how we get value from it. And so we're really at that moment now where, at least I hope most people in this room know, we need technical standards, we need interoperability, we need things to connect. It's the core of how we get value in a network society, but we also need to push on that to get that value out. And so just to give you a sense before I go to my wrap up, where we are now, we're basically in 1983. And so, that's not a bad place, right? I couldn't really rely on the email stats from earlier than 83, which is why I didn't go earlier. But, you look in the end of the 70s, early 80s, there are these like really small numbers of people using email, right? And this is something that we take for granted as having transformed society. And it was not long after 100,000 people are using email that we start to see that momentum. And so we are here at that ground floor. And we are all here with a revolution in mind with how we want to use this stuff. And it is something we can actually achieve to get from 100,000 to 1 million to 25 million to 2.8 billion. These things do happen in our world. And they happen through a combination of intent and ecosystems that actually create network effects and momentum and a bit of luck, or a lot of luck. I think we need that on our side as well. But that's where we are, and I think we need to look at this moment in time as something where we chart a path forward from that foundation, as opposed to declare victory because we can get this many people in a room to talk about badges. We really are just at the beginning. So just a quick piece on what Mozilla is doing, mostly so you saw those Mozilla people around, you can figure out what to talk to them about in the next 2 days. We really see ourselves in this, certainly as innovators, but as the plumbers. And it's how Mozilla has thought about itself on the web. And so I'm not going to show any plumber's butt. But not here on stage anyways, maybe in the bar. But you know, there's 3 things we're doing to help with the plumbing. Well, one is not quite just the plumbing, but one is the Open Badges infrastructure. So we are working on the standard through some stuff we'll announce. At the end of the day today, we really want to find ways for other people to share that standard with us and co-own it and co-evolve it. But certainly we see ourselves as the steward of that. We're also working on something, we're working on, man, so going to Staples. We're also working on something called Badge Kit, which we announced, I think, last year at DML, no, at MozFest in November, and we'll be releasing this year at DML. And it's basically a way to take a bunch of the open source tools that we have built around open badging and make it easier to adopt a badging system. And so for the cities who are going to be doing summers of learning this year or cities of learning this year, they'll hopefully use that. But the idea is, like, say like a Google Docs, it's something that anybody can really adopt if they want to be issuing badges and building it into how they're doing learning programs. And whether that's at an individual level as a teacher in a classroom or as a whole institution, that, you know, it's easy to kind of get into that. So that's something that we really started focusing on this year. And then, as I hinted at the beginning, a big piece of this is we're working on digital literacy badges to hopefully teach hundreds of millions of people around the world more about how the web works. So those are the 3 things we're plumbing on. If you either want to connect into any of those and help us or build on any of those things, there's lots of Mozilla people here to talk to you. And I guess that, you know, the last part on that building before I close and show you my children, which is obligatory in a Mark Surman talk, is, you know, this idea that you get in and build a piece of what is needed is kind of at the root of what we try to bring to the world. And I would invite others to take a similar approach. And so this is Firefox in 2003 is the little kind of almost non-existent orange in the bottom. And by 2009, it's 25% of the global browser share. And that was why we did Firefox. Was we didn't think people had choice on the internet, but also we thought web standards at that time were eroding with Microsoft's monopoly. And we didn't say, wave our arms, web standards. We didn't say we're going to solve all the problems of the internet. We said we're going to build the one thing or the few things that people need and just roll up our sleeves and do it. And that is how we will move this agenda forward, all of us, whether we're educators or technologists, is picking a piece of this that needs to get done, rolling up your sleeves and doing it, and then all of those things adding up together. And that's really the attitude we want to bring to our part of this, but encourage other people to do as well. So just a last little bit of a why for me and why I keep in this work and have been involved so long, other than I get to work with awesome people, like all of you. But these people I've been working with for a while. And you know, the trite thing is to say it's my kids. But I think in particular, like I remember me as that punk rock kid who was only a year or 2 older than my son Tristan, who's on your left. At the time, you know, they're going into not that different a school system than me. Granted, they're in awesome schools. Tristan's in an arts high school, but he hates math and science because it's taught the same way that math and science have been taught for 100 years, even though it's a really great school. And so I am motivated by something being different for them, but I'm also motivated by the fact that for me, a lot of my other settings that I've gone through as somebody who started my work career in the late 80s and now works in a very, very different world, is to see that for them and for their kids, we actually can make that shift. And so if you think about it, you know, that actually has happened in the world of work. That doesn't look that different than that school. And look, there's something amazing there. What's that? Right? So, you know, we did work, actually felt a lot. I still had a typewriter going to university, like that school as I started my career 20 years ago. And certainly computers already by that point had started to be a part of the world of work, but hadn't transformed a lot of sort of how it felt and how it functioned. But if I think about a Mozilla office, which this is not one, or the co-working spaces that my wife runs, which are a lot like this, how work has happened really changed a lot because of email, because of the ways in which we can communicate across organizations, across hierarchies, all of those kind of things. And so it is possible in a lifetime to imagine quite significant transformations to how institutions and our society works. The right combination of the nerds and transforming things with social practices can actually do that. And so for my kids, and just because I like a better world, I think we want to be able to do what we just saw happen in the workplace to schools and to how we think about learning. And that's not about judging those things. It's actually just about moving them to where we want to take them into the future. And I do think that badges are part of that. So let's do that.